everyone. It's great to be here in this virtual event. Thank you to Payoneer for having me. My name is David Spitz, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of ChannelAdvisor. Many of you know ChannelAdvisor. We are an e-commerce platform that helps sellers connect to many channels online all around the world and help them sell across channels like Walmart, Amazon, eBay, and hundreds of other channels all around the world. And we've been in business for 19 years, and so we've seen e-commerce evolve pretty substantially over close to 2 decades. And I'm here today to share with you a little bit about the state of e-commerce, and in particular, the effect that COVID-19 has had on e-commerce and some of the trends that we're seeing and some of the expectations that we have going forward. So I suspect some of you have seen me speak before, either at a previous Payoneer event or our own customer event. One of the things I typically start with is what I call the forces shaping the landscape. So that could be the rise of certain channels like Amazon or Alibaba, social commerce. It could be the increasing use of mobile devices, the importance of data, cross-border trade, even regulatory pressures. And we typically spend a lot of time thinking about how those different forces are shaping the landscape to help our customers and to help you understand how to adapt to the changes that we anticipate coming from those. What's a little bit different this year is that there's a new force that has hit the landscape, and the metaphor that I use is this is kind of like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, and that asteroid is COVID-19 that has just really kind of come out of nowhere and just dramatically altered the landscape, much more so than we typically talk about these forces. And I'm sure everybody has all sorts of experiences that they can speak to at a personal level and a business level about the impact on them. But I wanted to step back and maybe shape the broader landscape. So the first thing I would say is, and I'm looking at U.S. data right here. COVID-19 has caused an economic halt and contraction, frankly, the likes of which none of us has really ever seen. And it's not only done so in one particular country or region or location. This is really global, and it has happened almost simultaneously all around the world. And it's something that none of us has experienced in either a personal or professional setting. And this chart just shows you the magnitude of the job losses, in particular in the U.S. Now you can see that there's been a recovery over the last few months, a partial recovery, but we are still well below the levels that we saw during the great financial crisis, which you can see is in blue there. But the other thing I want to call your attention to is how rapidly this impacted U.S. employment. I mean, that collapse of millions and millions of jobs at the onset of this pandemic was so significant and so severe that it really has no comparison to past economic cycles. And of course, it isn't just in the U.S. This chart shows you the relative difference in GDP change from Q1 to Q2 across a variety of countries in Europe. And you can see that in all cases, we're talking about double-digit declines in gross domestic product. So this is really a global phenomenon that has affected almost every community and every country in some shape or fashion. It's also had a profound impact on retail. And what you can see here is this is U.S. retail sales, and you can see that this chart goes back about 15 years, and you can see in the orange line there, which represents the change from the prior month, that right about in that March-April timeframe, we had a collapse that we've really never seen before. So as you can see, the sequential change in retail typically hovers around 1 or 2%. Sometimes it's negative, like during the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. But even then, it was negative to the tune of maybe negative 3% sequentially. And you can see here in the COVID era on the right side that again we saw retail declines double digit, but then it rebounded quite quickly as lockdowns started to relax and stores started to reopen. But it wasn't really what I would call a V-shaped recovery, because if we break that data out and we look at traditional retail sales versus e-commerce, you can see that the rebound on the previous slide was really driven by e-commerce, and retail sales continue, generally speaking, to be negative. So that's the blue line there is the retail sales, and the orange line is e-commerce. And you can see that e-commerce had been growing pretty consistently in the mid-teens in the U.S. and spiked to almost 50%, excuse me, in the second quarter of 2020. And it makes some sense in retrospect. As stores were closed and people were sheltering at home, they still had to buy products, and increasingly a lot of that shifted online. And what's interesting is that it wasn't necessarily the usual products that we expect to see. One example is in the middle of March, we saw what we call the Great Toilet Paper Run of 2020. And I'm not really sure what the psychology was behind people hoarding toilet paper, but they were hoarding, and supply chains really couldn't keep up with it. It was an unusual scene in the U.S. for people to go to the store, and this was not just in the U.S., this was in Europe too, to go to the store and find that the shelves were completely empty of paper products. In fact, in the middle of March, we saw about a 25,000% increase in toilet paper sales during that period. And you can see that the panic lasted for a couple of weeks, and then subsided and came back down. And part of the reason for that is that when people gave up on toilet paper, they moved on to other solutions. And this shows you the relative growth rate of bidets. And I'm pretty sure that many Americans before this didn't even know how to pronounce bidet. But there you go. Things change, you adapt, and this was people getting creative with their solutions. And if I had a live audience in front of me, I would probably pause right now and do a survey and see how many of you gave up on toilet paper and purchased a bidet. But I can't do that during the virtual event, so I'll just have to imagine what the response would be. But in any case, so if you net it out, generally speaking, I think the consensus is pretty clear that we have seen an acceleration of e-commerce as a share of wallet that is probably at least 5 years, and maybe even more, that's been pulled forward into the first half of this year and going into the fourth quarter here of 2020. Just a pretty remarkable change. And so often the question you hear is, and I pulled this from Twitter. I thought it was a great meme that was going around earlier, was that the question is, who led the digital transformation of your company? Was it the CEO or the CTO? And if people are being honest, in many cases the answer was really COVID-19. And I think what we've seen this year is that companies that have been able to adapt and be agile and nimble and sort of recognize the situation and in some cases lean into it, those who are flexible and adaptable generally have done pretty well, of course, depending on the category of product, and those who maybe didn't have that kind of flexibility have really struggled this year. One of the categories that's kind of interesting is grocery, and online grocery in particular. Now, grocery has been historically fairly underpenetrated compared to the rest of e-commerce. People, by and large, in the U.S. and Europe, continued to go to stores, and while online was growing, it was still a relatively small percentage of grocery sales before this year, anyway. And of course, COVID had a similar impact. So on the left side there, you can see the change from the previous year in online grocery sales as COVID rolled out. And you can see that there were some substantial upticks in volumes with companies like Instacart and Walmart. And by the way, online grocery includes things like buy online and pick up in store or curbside pickup, but anything that includes the digital path. And what you can see in the U.S., so last year, online grocery sales were growing at a pretty good clip at about 22%. And the projection, this is from a publication called Supermarket News and from Coresight Research, is that this year it'll accelerate pretty dramatically to 40%. In my opinion, is this might even be conservative. We're beginning to see second waves of COVID, and I don't think we're close to a point in the U.S. or in Europe where anybody feels comfortable that this is behind us. So I suspect we'll probably continue to see pretty elevated levels of online grocery shopping that might make this 40% number for 2020 conservative. And then what this shows you is relative share of online grocery sales in a few select countries, including UK, Spain, France, and China. And I would say, in most cases, in particular in the UK and China, they've been ahead of the US for some number of years in terms of things like click and collect. Partly because of population density and the ease with which consumers can leverage these systems. But you can see that even in those countries that have already been kind of a step ahead of everybody, the acceleration of share of online grocery has been pretty substantial. So this seems to be an area that was underpenetrated previously, and COVID is going to accelerate it. In the US, one of the more interesting recent developments has been the launch of Walmart Plus. Walmart Plus is essentially positioned as an alternative to Amazon Prime. Although when I say alternative, it doesn't mean that consumers, necessarily have to pick one versus the other. We suspect that there may be a number of consumers who might even select both. And Walmart Prime gives you a few advantages. It costs $98 a year, so it's a little bit cheaper than Amazon Prime. It includes unlimited free delivery like Prime, but importantly also includes grocery, right? So one of the areas that Walmart has an advantage is in the thousands of stores that they have that are within 10% of about 90% of, within 10 miles of about 90% of the US population. So Walmart has an advantage in terms of being able to get grocery delivery to people's houses that Amazon really can't match at this point. So that's a pretty big benefit, that unlimited free grocery delivery. Plus they have some discounts on fuel where they offer fuel at their stores. They also have a system that is unlocked for you as a consumer where you can scan and go in the store and effectively skip the checkout line for members of Walmart Plus. And it appears that there's a lot of interest in this. It launched September 15th, so it's just about a month old. So it's quite a new program at this point. But as you can see, based on this survey, this is from Raymond James, about half of Walmart shoppers are either very likely to subscribe or somewhat likely to subscribe, which is pretty strong awareness given how new the program is. And even if you look at all shoppers, there's a majority of those who potentially are going to shop at Walmart that they would be likely to or somewhat likely to subscribe. So it appears that there's actually pretty strong interest in Walmart Plus, despite the fact that Amazon Prime has pretty good penetration in the US and in Europe. And I suspect that grocery is probably the big differentiator for Walmart. And so it'll be interesting to see how that program unfolds. And in particular, how many households potentially end up being members of both programs. So as we look at the outlook a little bit, I wanted to step back and look at a little bit of macroeconomic trends. This is, again, U.S. data. This comes from U.S. employment census data. And it shows you what's called continued claims. And this is basically a measure of how many people remain unemployed. And as you can see, this data actually goes back quite a long ways. It goes back to the late 1960s. And so this covers a lot of economic cycles. And you can see the oil shock of the 1970s, the early 1980s recession, even the 2009, 2008 great financial crisis. As big as those were, they are quite small compared to the impact of COVID. So this gives you a sense of the magnitude of job losses that have happened as part of COVID. And while it's come back down a bit, we are a long way from anywhere close to what we might consider normal. And we see this in a variety of data points as well. This is data from the TSA, which shows air travelers and the change of air travelers going through airports on a year-over-year basis. And you can see it went close to zero in the early days of this pandemic. and has recovered a little bit. But air travel is still, if you look at the data there, is off about 65 to 70%. So 2/3 of the air travel that we saw last year has basically evaporated, which probably doesn't surprise anybody, but that's a significant amount of economic activity that has been curtailed. This data is from OpenTable, and it's global data, and it shows what they call seated diners. This is basically a measure of how many people are making reservations to go to a restaurant through the OpenTable system, and they've got pretty broad coverage, so it's a pretty good indicator of dining activity at restaurants. And the first thing I'll point out is just how amazing it is in that kind of March-April timeframe, where it basically restaurant activity went to zero. Obviously, many restaurants were closed through lockdowns, but people were just not dining out at all. And it's made some recovery since then. There's a little spike there in early September. The UK actually had, I can't remember the name of the program, but it was a program where the government was basically subsidizing some dining out in an effort to encourage people to go out and enjoy some meals and support the restaurant industry. But as you can see, it's kind of gotten stuck there at about a 40% decline. And this obviously varies by country. And as we've been going through an uptick in COVID cases, it's quite possible that as this data refreshes, this goes through close to the end of September, it's quite possible in the next few weeks that we might actually see this tick back down as more restrictions are put in place. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Here's an interesting chart that shows the personal savings rate of the U.S. consumer. And the U.S. consumer has never really been known as a strong saver. So if you look at history, and again, this is data that goes all the way back to the 1960s. For most of the last few decades, the U.S. personal savings rate has been in the single digits, sometimes even lower in the low single digits. And what you can see on the right there is one really interesting phenomenon during COVID is that personal savings rate peaked at close to 35%, which is unprecedented in history. And it's come down since. I think it's about 18% in the latest survey that I've seen, which is still comparatively quite high. And the reason for this is that there's been a huge amount of government stimulus in the form of stimulus checks and unemployment benefits, and that have really buoyed the consumer. So on the one hand, you have people who have not lost their jobs, who have been earning their salary and not had an opportunity to spend it, right? So we just saw air travel is down, restaurants are down, things like vacation spending are down. There's not a lot of places where employed people have been able to deploy their earnings. So it's been going into savings. And even for those who've been unemployed, those stimulus programs and those unemployment benefits, which of course have since run out, but earlier in the year, those also helped buoy consumers who were unemployed. And so the effect of this is actually quite interesting. This is what's called the M1 money supply, which is a technical term, but it's basically a measure of how much cash is on deposit in the U.S. banking system. And again, this is data that goes back many, many decades. And what you can see there on the right side is that we went in 2020 from about $10 trillion in cash on deposit to close to 12 trillion. It was about a 20% increase in cash on deposit in the span of 9 months. And that it took, just to give you a comparison, it took from 1975 to the year 2000 to drive a similar increase in cash on deposit. And so this is very different from the financial crisis, where the government basically lent money and capitalized banks, but much of that money didn't find its way into consumer depository accounts. In this cycle, money, it's been called helicopter money in the past, and it literally means flying helicopters and dropping cash on consumers. That's basically what's happened, and all of that cash has gone on deposit into accounts. And $2 trillion is quite a lot of money, and obviously some of that has gotten deployed in terms of spending on e-commerce. But as you can see, this is a measure of what's on deposit, and quite a lot of it has not been spent. And this is a little bit of a different reaction than we've seen in previous historical financial crises or economic cycles. And so it's kind of interesting, right? Because if you put all those things together, you have these forces that are kind of operating against each other. And it's really an open question as to which ones will be stronger. So on the upper left here, we clearly have continued significant unemployment, and in the U.S. right now, a lack of additional stimulus. Right now, there's a lot of political negotiations going on around the stimulus. Whether there'll be an additional one. Of course, we have the added complexity of a significant election here in the U.S. in just a few weeks, which affects the political calculus of those negotiations. But the fact that unemployment is still high and there's a lack of additional stimulus is a negative impact on consumers. But on the right side, upper right side, you have all that cash that I just indicated is pent up cash, right? So, is that pressure behind the dam, so to speak? Is that money that is just waiting to be deployed, and is it waiting for COVID to subside and people are just excited about traveling again or eating out, or is that money going to start to get deployed here in the fourth quarter as people start to spend money on holiday shopping online? It remains to be seen. And then on the lower left, you've got supply chain shocks. So we talked somewhat humorously about toilet paper, but there are many segments of the industry that have been impacted by supply chain difficulties, like laptops and all sorts of categories where the spikes in demand really caught a lot of supply chain off guard. The other big question is around logistics and fulfillment, in particular here in the fourth quarter. So we're literally in the middle of Amazon Prime Day yesterday and today, and Amazon moved that day into October primarily to pull forward some of the holiday demand and ease some of the stress on their fulfillment and logistics operations. And there's a big question as to how is the logistics and fulfillment capacity going to deal with what is expected to be a really strong e-commerce holiday? And is that going to create a lot of delays and other issues as the fourth quarter progresses, which could be a negative on overall e-commerce? But then again, offsetting that in the lower right, you have the potential for a second wave of COVID, which I think we're starting to see in the US and in Europe. Which could drive increased restrictions and store closures, and just like we saw early in the pandemic, might drive more spending online. And these things are all hard to predict, right? Will there be additional stimulus or not? Is all that cash on consumers' balance sheets going to get deployed, or are people going to be conservative and kind of hold on to it? Will there be a second wave? Will it lead to more restrictions? How will capacity, fulfillment, and logistics capacity handle increased demand? If I had a snow globe and I was trying to predict this stuff, it's a really foggy globe. Its visibility is low, I think I would say. And we see that with consumers as well. So, this is a survey that we actually did twice. We did one in April and one in August. And I think we surveyed 1,000 consumers. And a couple of interesting data points, right? So first, up top there, you see that there's a significant increase, a doubling of the number of respondents who said that they expect to shop online for groceries more than they did in the past. And so I think this is a sign of consumers settling into a new normal. And of course, not surprisingly, on the bottom there, also an increase in the percentage of consumers who expect to shop online more than they did before the pandemic. So all signs point to continued robust online shopping activity, but it's also metered a little bit by consumers expecting, so consumers throughout the year have experienced significant delays, right, or shortages, right? So things like laptops and other products. And so that has also conditioned the consumer to be a little bit wary of delivery times, right? So you can see that about half of the respondents were concerned that packages will be late this holiday season. And that's a pretty significant proportion of respondents who have that concern. And what that's driving is the second point, where close to 60% of respondents expect to start doing their holiday shopping before November 1st. And when we ran this survey, this was before Amazon had officially moved Prime Day to October. And so this is without even people having the benefit of knowing that Prime Day was going to be in October, which I'm sure has only added to this trend. And interestingly, a significant majority, 78% of consumers said that they would be willing to wait longer for the delivery of their orders. And so the way I read all of this is that consumers have gotten smart this year. They're going to shop more online, both in terms of grocery and regular e-commerce, but they know that the system is under stress, especially from a logistics and fulfillment and supply chain perspective. So they're going to be doing their shopping earlier. And whereas we normally see the holiday period kind of really kick off in mid-November and peak in mid-December, I would not be surprised to see that activity pulled forward into October. So especially with Prime Day now. So our view is that the holiday starts earlier. It's more sustained. It maybe doesn't have quite the same peak. It maybe takes all of that demand and kind of spreads it out a little bit longer over the course of Q4. And then lastly, as we look forward beyond Q4, of course, visibility is challenged. But I think the general consensus, and we share this view, is that we're very unlikely to go back to pre-COVID levels of e-commerce volumes. We think that a lot of these habits that consumers have formed during the pandemic are likely to stick. We think that the step function change in e-commerce share and penetration is largely going to stay elevated going forward, and that we're not going to go back. And we see some new developments in things like grocery, where we think that there will be a substantial acceleration in digital sales. So the most important thing I can share with those of you who are sellers is that what we've seen is the most important characteristic is just being adaptable, being flexible, being nimble. And that's on everything from supply chain to logistics and fulfillment, and even budgeting for things like digital marketing. The customers that we've seen be most successful are those who could really adapt quickly to whatever the circumstances were on a given day or a given week or a given month. And the companies that didn't have that kind of flexibility were the ones that really ultimately I think struggled more. So the other trend that we think this is accelerated is that a lot of brands realizing that their digital transformation strategy, they might have had a 3-year or 4-year or 5-year plan. They have now got mandates to accelerate those plans and get them done much faster. Sometimes this year, sometimes in the course of the next year. So we're seeing a lot of brands who are saying, right, my 3 or 4 or 5-year plan to go direct to consumer and get closer to the consumer, I now have to execute that right away because my retail channel really is under stress, and we need to find a new path to our consumers. So that's the other trend that we're seeing. So we did publish some data on the URL is blog.channeladvisor.com earlier in the sort of April-May timeframe, where you can see some interesting category trends. It's a little bit dated now. We are going to try to publish some interesting insights as the holiday unfurls here. So if you haven't visited our blog, you may want to go and subscribe, and we're going to try to post some interesting things that we see as this unusual year comes to a close this holiday season. And so before I open it up to Q&A, I'll just say that I hope everybody has been safe during this period. I'm sure many, if not most of you, have been touched either personally or professionally by COVID, whether it's a family member or yourself. And we know that this has been a pretty serious and tragic pandemic for many people. So I hope that all of you have been able to remain safe and will continue to do so. And I appreciate the time. And so that is it in terms of the presentation materials I have. And I believe I am ready to go to Q&A. And I don't know, Ron, if there is something I need to do to enable that. I believe the chat window is open. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. That's for sure something I can see. And by the way, Johnny says the UK name for the restaurant subsidy program was Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Thank you, Johnny, for that. That was a long name. That's why I couldn't remember it. So if there are questions, I'm not sure if I am able to see them. I'm looking over on the Q&A tab. I'm looking over on the chat tab. Hopefully you were able to hear my presentation. Well, I don't see any questions at the moment, but I will keep the window open here for at least a few minutes just to see if there are questions that come in, and I'll type one in the chat as well. And I'll also turn off, there we go, screen sharing. Okay, so Ron, I don't know if I have any questions showing up or if there's something else I should turn on. But again, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat, which I can see right here next to my window, and I'll be happy to answer it. And I'll leave the window open for a few more minutes. Hamid says, thank you for your presentation. I couldn't hear all of it. Hopefully that was not for everybody. But Hamid said, looks like you have a question, so feel free. Go ahead. And I'll read the question when it comes in. So let's see. I see something over here in Q&A. So maybe while Hamid is typing his question, Jackie writes, can you share some specific product categories that increased a lot in COVID-19? Yeah, so I talked about toilet paper, but we saw things like home office furnishings. So when people realized they were going to be working at home for quite some time, we saw an uptick in that. We saw comfortable apparel do pretty well, like slippers, sweatpants, the kinds of things that people working from home, wanted to wear. And conversely, we saw a decrease in things like formal wear and more business attire. More recently, when people are doing more school from home, we saw a huge demand for things like laptops and desks and things to help kids be able to do their schooling from home. So much so that there was significant delays in getting those products. And we detail a fair amount of this on our blog. So again, that's blog.channeladvisor.com. And like I said, we're hoping to provide some additional updates during this holiday season, so you can see some of the trends that we're seeing. So that's a good question. One of my favorite categories in the spring, or I guess it was the early summer, was inflatable bouncy houses. Those inflatable castles that kids can jump around in. And it took me a while to figure that one out. And basically, I think what was happening is there were so many parents with young kids at home, and the parents were trying to do work, that they needed a place to put their kids to burn off some energy, without them wandering off. So we saw an uptick in things like that, outdoor pools, inflatable pools. Those were other popular categories. But I encourage you to go to our blog and subscribe to it, so you can see some of the additional data that we publish here. So that's a good question. Jackie asked a follow-up question: does average order value in furniture increase? Jackie, that's a good question. I haven't looked at the average order value for furniture. I'm not aware of significant changes in pricing as it relates to furniture. More than pricing, what we've just seen is kind of slower delivery times. But consumers have basically come to expect that. So that's a good question. So let's see. I'm jumping over to the chat here, and Hamid says, well, I wanted to start a business and create a hardware kind of product. Well, no time like the present, Hamid. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I would say that it's always an interesting thing to do. you'd have to probably be a little more specific if you wanted me to give you some reaction to what kind of product. Ivor says, hello from Croatia. Ivor, it's good to connect with you. One of my early mentors when I started my career was from Croatia. So it's good to connect with you. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A. Happy to answer anything I can. I've never been to Croatia, by the way. I hear this is the hot spot. Well, before all these travel restrictions, it was the hot spot for travelers from the U.S. to go visit. But I have not been. I look forward to getting there one day. So I'm just looking at the Q&A tab and the chat tab. So I'll keep it open for maybe 2 or 3 more minutes in case there are additional questions that I'm happy to answer. And by the way, while we're waiting to see if there are additional ones, I'm located in North Carolina, which is in the southeast of the U.S. That's where ChannelAdvisor's headquarters are, and it's where I live. And I have been basically sitting in this room since March. So like many of you, I'm sure. All right. Ivor says, any predictions on what is about to come in new wave of COVID? Any expectations for online jobs? So if the question is, there's another question I'll come to in a minute. But the questions were around, new wave of COVID. I'm not a healthcare worker or professional, and so it's just speculation on my part. I was talking to a friend of mine who is in the healthcare industry who said that the big surprise in the medical community is that the summertime didn't have the sort of effect on coronavirus that the typically warmer temperatures do have on viruses, like on other coronaviruses. And so there's a concern that it's a pretty robust virus that with the arrival of colder weather and drier air and more people spending more time inside, that there could be a pretty significant second wave here as we go into the fall and into the winter. And I think the evidence is that we're starting to see some of that in the US and in Europe. So, what effect that has now, thankfully, so far, the mortality rate has been lower than it was early in the pandemic. And so maybe the improvements in treatments, can help mitigate some of that. But we'll have to see. And then the question is, any expectations for online jobs? I think this is one of the bright spots in this is the proof that technical work and digital work in general can be done pretty much anywhere. And so I think you'll continue to see strong demand for online and technical skills. And I think the benefit now is that a lot of that work can be done from pretty much anywhere on Earth. And so I think that's probably still a strong place to be. I'm going to jump. So Ivor, I see another question there, but I'm going to jump to, I hope I pronounced this correctly. Yawad Badri says, hello, I'm from Morocco. I started in e-commerce and eBay, but the problem was eBay was suspended his account. After we listed our first item in the eBay seller account, we received an email account was suspended. So can you please help us to remove the suspension because we were about to start a new business on eBay? So, that happens to a lot of people. I don't know what your specific situation might be. We do work with our customers who trip over some of those suspension issues, whether it's, eBay or Amazon or other channels. But unfortunately, we restrict that to working with our customers because it does take a fair amount of work. So, Yawad, if you're an existing customer, reach out to me on LinkedIn and we'll see if we can help you out. So, and Ivor, just saying you work online as an entrepreneur and a programmer and consultant, and you're making your way and searching the space in the global market, and that you do feel sort of that tailwind that's happening. So good. I'm glad to hear it. It makes me happy that despite all the problems with the pandemic, that there are some positive things, like it's creating opportunities for people all around the world to step into the economy in ways that maybe they weren't able to do previously. So that's a bright spot. So TJ, Appreciate the invitation here. You let me know if that's a wrap or if you want me to hang on here for a few more minutes. I'll keep it open for another minute or two. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I feel like I should be doing some of that live streaming commerce. I should be like trying to sell you guys a product or something. Okay. I don't see any other chats or questions, and so I'm going to wrap it up here. I do want to say thank you to Payoneer for having me. ChannelAdvisor and Payoneer have worked together for a number of years in a good partnership. And if you are a seller who would like some help getting distribution online into various channels, we at ChannelAdvisor would be happy to help you. So just go to ChannelAdvisor.com and we can help you out. Oh, I see one more question here. Sandeep says, do you think there will be any regulation changes due to COVID? Wow, that's a big question. I certainly think there will be some permanent changes. How many of them are regulatory or not, I don't know the answer to that. But I suspect that all of us have gone through a period where we recognize that the importance of things like masking and social distancing, and I think there are going to be some changes with companies in terms of how their workforces are configured. Beyond that, it's hard to speculate. But this has been a huge economic shock to pretty much every country in the world, and I would not be surprised if it in the long term had regulatory consequences as well. That's a good question. Thank you, Sandeep. Okay, well, I'm going to call that a wrap, everybody. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Payoneer, for having me. Thank you to all the participants who joined me today, and in particular to those of you who asked questions or offered comments. I wish you good luck out there. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a productive holiday season, and thank you for your time today.